What is going on, everyone? Today we are going to be ranking every single Marvel Cinematic Universe movie from the worst to the best. This is only the MCU films, the main MCU films. I'm not doing the Sony Spider-Man films. I ranked those actually back after No Way Home came out, so if you want to watch that, definitely check that out as well. That should be in my movie ranking lists playlist, so definitely go check that out. And we're also only doing the movies, so not the specials, not the MCU shows, none of that, just the 30 films. Let's get right into it. Coming in last place and number 30th spot is going to be Thor: The Dark World. So Thor: The Dark World is the only MCU movie, or at least one of the only MCU movies that I really don't get much enjoyment out of. I can watch it, I can put it on and maybe be into like some of the scenes, mainly the stuff with Loki. I think Loki in this movie is actually really great. Obviously Thor is enjoyable to watch as well, but he's not that present in terms of how good he is in the other movies. His charming presence doesn't really come out as much in this movie, I feel like, and that's because they don't really give him that much to do. And the stuff to do with Loki, like I said, it's really fun to watch him in this film. I think this is one of Loki's better movies, surprisingly, but even then it just doesn't go much past that, right? Everything else is just very plain, boring, and stale. Malekith as the main villain is without a doubt one of the worst villains in MCU history, so this is just not a very rewatchable film, not a very good one. It doesn't really do much for the franchise. It doesn't really have that interesting of a story either. It does focus a bit on one of the Infinity Stones, but I just don't care about most of it. I really don't. In the 29th spot, I've got Captain Marvel. So Captain Marvel's biggest problem is Captain Marvel herself. Now, I don't think Brie Larson's a bad actress. She's fantastic, and I do think she does pretty good in this role, and especially when we saw her in Endgame, as well as that little scene in Miss Marvel, I think she's actually pretty good there. But this film, she just feels so lifeless, and that was kind of the point. She's supposed to kind of be emotionless in some ways, but it makes her a very unlikable protagonist, and that makes this movie very hard to get into. So the whole time, I just don't really care about this main character. Of course, Samuel Jackson definitely holds this movie up a little bit because he's always great and no matter what he does, and Nick Fury's a great character, but I really hate how they completely take away the badassery of his eye patch by making him get the eye patch only because of a cat. Like, that was such a lazy way to explain that. I felt like it was just there for a comedic joke and it just did not work, which this movie does try to go for a lot of comedic jokes, and it just doesn't work in this movie. It doesn't have the tone for it, but they still go there anyways. The villain is without a doubt one of the worst and most boring, generic villains we've ever seen in the MCU as well. So there's just not a lot of stuff about the movie I really like that much. I think the Skrulls are fun though. The Skrulls are cool. I like them a lot, but that's really it. There's just not much to this movie. In the 28th spot, I've got The Incredible Hulk. So The Incredible Hulk is the one MCU movie that could definitely be taken out of the MCU and people really wouldn't notice the difference because it just doesn't really feel like it's a part of the MCU. It doesn't have the MCU charm. It definitely doesn't fit because of obviously the recasting of Edward Norton, Bruce Banner, to now being Mark Ruffalo. I actually think Edward Norton was a great Bruce Banner. I will say he was great in the role, but he's one of the only things about this film I really like. Obviously General Ross is pretty cool to see as well in there. He doesn't really do much more in the rest of the franchise other than in Civil War, but it was nice to see him. I think he does have a good position in this film. I think Betty Ross in this movie was not very great, especially with her chemistry with Bruce Banner. It just didn't connect at all. I'm not surprised we haven't seen her again in the MCU. I don't know, there was not much there. I didn't really like that too much. Abomination, I think, is an okay villain. He's not that cool, I guess. He was fun to watch in the couple action scenes they had towards the end of the film. I definitely think the end of the film is way superior compared to the first two acts of the film, because most of it does kind of just feel like a generic story, a generic superhero story. It doesn't really do anything that I personally find to be that interesting, so it's just not that good. In the 27th spot, I've got Iron Man 2. Iron Man 2 is a movie I definitely don't think is nearly as bad as some people make it out to be, but it's definitely also not that great. I do enjoy how Tony's very much not stable in this movie. I mean, sometimes it gets a little bit annoying, but there is a lot of merit to it because he's not a perfect person, right? He's very much clearly not a perfect person. He has a big growth throughout the franchise. So seeing him in a state where he's just kind of all over the place, I mean, the whole party sequence where he's getting all drunk and stuff like that kind of shows where he was at in a lot of this film. I think he does come around and eventually he kind of grows past that, especially once we get to the first Avengers film. But I think my biggest issue with this movie is that it doesn't do much at all. Like, it's not like I need every film to have some big importance to the MCU, but this film doesn't really do much even just for his character or for really any characters in this movie. A lot of it is also introducing stuff, like we introduced Black Widow to this movie, and obviously that kind of leads into the first Avengers film. They have a lot of setup for the next Avengers film, which I guess you can say works for this movie, but a lot of it also felt like, do we really need that right now? I feel like if they focused more on characters like Whiplash and Justin Hammer, I think we could have had a much better plot, because I do actually enjoy Justin Hammer. I think he's actually really great in this movie. Sam Rockwell is amazing in that role, and I believe we are going to be seeing him again, so I'm excited to see that. Whiplash, though, just kind of feels like he's just there. I mean, he has cool powers, cool abilities, but he doesn't really do much for the story. So I feel like if they focus more on them and less on building up for the next Avengers movie, then I think this movie could have been a lot better. In number 26 spot, I've got Ant-Man and the Wasp. So I love the first Ant-Man. You'll see that way higher on this list. But this one, I just felt like just didn't feel like it had the same charm as the first one. And one of my biggest issues is actually the fact that Ant-Man's barely in this movie. Like, he's in the movie a lot, I guess, but he doesn't do that much, is what I really mean. Like, he doesn't have that many awesome action sequences. He doesn't really have that much character growth, at least in my opinion. I feel like this movie mainly centers itself around the Wasp, and I don't have an issue with that. She's a great character. She's awesome. But it felt like you could have just made this a Wasp movie at that point, because it feels like he took such a back seat to the point where I didn't find him interesting in this movie. You know, compared to the first one, I mean, he was like incredible in that first one. He was so much fun. He did so many crazy things. Second one, he just kind of feels like he's just kind of there. The main focus is on Ghost and the Wasp, I feel like. And Ghost is a decent villain. I don't think she was like great or anything, but she was okay. She definitely was one of the more sympathetic villains. She definitely wasn't like this evil person that you just absolutely hated. So it was nice to see that, I guess. I think one of the biggest issues, though, this movie did come out at a terrible time. It came out right after Infinity War and before Endgame, so it was right in between these massive movies. So this movie just felt so small in comparison, and that's what it's supposed to be, but it's hard to really get into it at that time when you were like really looking forward to the next Avengers film. The movie also doesn't have nearly as good of humor as the first one. The first one was very comedic, but the humor was really, really good. Whereas in this one, I felt like it was lacking in actual good humor. So I don't know, just definitely not one of my favorite MCU films, but I don't think it's terrible. In the 25th spot, I've got Eternals. Eternals, I was going into it expecting it to be terrible, like the worst Marvel film ever, because that's what people were making it out to be. I don't think it was that bad, but it definitely wasn't that great either. We're starting to get to the films that I don't think are too bad. I just don't really love these ones either. Eternals is visually stunning. It's definitely probably, I would say, the best looking Marvel film. I think so, at least in terms of visual effects and CGI. It's incredible how this movie looks. The cast is solid too. Great actors, great actresses. Really awesome cast. But my positives kind of stop there. Like, there really isn't that much to this movie that I find to be that interesting. The story is good, but the way it's executed is just all over the place, and the pacing is not good at all. It's a really long movie, and it doesn't really warrant that runtime. The structure is awful. They have like all sorts of like, you know, scenes in the past and then some scenes in the present, and they don't really connect all that well. And a lot of the characters, because there's so many, like I said, I love the cast, but not enough of the characters are given enough screen time for me to really care about them. So a lot of them end up just kind of being background characters. So yeah, I didn't like that. But like I said, visually stunning, and it was a good soundtrack, good cast. So I guess it wasn't terrible because of that. In number 24th spot, this one is gonna definitely be unpopular. I know for a fact. Black Panther, the first Black Panther. This is definitely unpopular, but we're starting to get to the movies that I think are at least okay. Like, we're done with the bad movies. The rest of these I think are all at least decent, and they're gonna obviously keep getting better and better as they go along. But Black Panther, I think, has one of the best villains in the MCU. Killmonger is an incredible villain. He's kind of a representation of radicalism and how that can affect people, and I think the way they focus on that is quite good. And I think a lot of what they do with this movie in terms of introducing us to this larger world outside of the United States with Wakanda, I think was really cool, because especially when you see most of the MCU movies, a lot of them do just take place in the United States. Like, that's where the main central story takes place. You might have like little scenes in other countries here and there, but a lot of it is usually just centered around people in the United States, right? So it was really cool to see how things are going on other parts of the world. And we're starting to see more of that even with Phase 4. But seeing Wakanda, just getting to see it for the first time, like it's such a crazy thing. And we got first introduced to the character of Black Panther in Civil War, of course. This is going to be where my negatives come into play. Obviously, Chadwick Boseman is incredible as T'Challa. Incredible. But I think the character of T'Challa was 1,000 times more interesting and 1,000 times better written in Civil War. And then when he got into the Black Panther movie, he didn't do much in the movie that I felt like gave him much of an arc, where it was his own movie, so he should have had this really deep and intense arc, and I never really felt that. I felt like the main focus was on Killmonger, which is fine, because he's a great villain, but it kind of did take away from T'Challa in terms of what he was able to do in that movie. He just kind of felt like, you know, your typical good guy. He's just there to be the opposite of Killmonger, pretty much, and I don't know. I wish they did more with him. I wish he was a little bit better, because in Civil War, I think his character was just incredible, and I just didn't feel it the same way in this film. And another thing, the CGI in this movie has a lot of issues, and it's really annoying because the movie is like got so many creative visuals, and they could be so much better if they actually presented them in a way that looked decent. It doesn't look like you're watching like a video game cutscene. And mainly in the action scenes, everything besides that looks stunning. Like when you just get shots of Wakanda, it all looks beautiful. But then when you get like action scenes specifically with like Black Panther versus Killmonger, it starts to look really clunky, and I'm just not a fan. The plot as well in this movie, I do feel like is slightly messy. It's not terrible. Again, I think this is a decent movie, but it's a little messy. In number 23 spot, I've got Thor, the first Thor movie. This movie, I can kind of split it up, right? The stuff on Earth is great, but the stuff on Asgard, I don't like that much. That's basically how this film goes for me. Once you get to Thor, or once you get to Earth, it kind of becomes a fish out of water story, and I usually love those stories. I think they're usually pretty interesting, and it's pretty funny watching Thor kind of just roaming around Earth with Jane and the others, and just trying to learn about humans and what, you know, people do on Earth. And I do really love Loki as a villain in this film. I mean, obviously Loki's one of the best villains in the MCU, and he is really great here. And I do think the scenes with Loki on Asgard are pretty damn great. I don't think everything on Asgard's bad. It's just some of the stuff I'm just not crazy about. Some of the stuff does feel a little bit too Shakespearean for me, at least for my standards. But besides that, I think it's a very run-of-the-mill MCU film. I think this is definitely the best example of just an average MCU film. Like it's just, I don't know, it's just average. I don't have many good things to say about it. I don't have many bad things to say about it. It's just kind of there. In number 22 spot, I've got Doctor Strange, the first Doctor Strange movie. This one was really different for its time because we just weren't getting stuff like this before in the MCU. So to see this like magical side of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was so different. And the visuals for that are outstanding. I mean, it's really crazy visuals this movie has. I mean, obviously the sequel goes even further with some of those visuals, but this first one looked really cool. And I love the character of Stephen Strange. I think he is one of the best characters in the MCU for sure, especially after like Endgame, and really more so Infinity War, after Infinity War, and of course the second film. I think he's been incredible in those ones as well. But I really love how he starts off being so arrogant, and he's just like such a man of science, and he just doesn't believe anything out of, you know, the science realm, which doesn't make him arrogant, but he's arrogant for other reasons. And then he gets introduced to this whole world of magic, and obviously at first he's like, I don't believe in that shit, and then he finds out it is true, and he gets, you know, involved in it. And I really love his kind of relationship with the Ancient One and how she's like this mentor to him, and the way the story works off of that is really great. I think where this movie falls flat is definitely the third act. I love the first two acts of this film, but that third act is really messy. It doesn't have a good ending. It doesn't land in the way it should, and the main villain of this film is pretty bad. It sucks because the actor is incredible, but he's just a wasted villain in my opinion. I didn't like him too much. In number 21 spot, Spider-Man Far From Home. I know this is so damn low for a lot of people, but I'm just not a big fan of Far From Home. It's not my kind of Spider-Man movie. So the good about this movie though, visual effects with Mysterio was always a great thing to see. I think Mysterio's, in terms of the visuals, I think he's a great villain in terms of that, but I'm not crazy about him in terms of his motivation. I will say that, because he's just another one of those, oh, I hate Tony Stark, and I didn't like that. I didn't like his motivation. I didn't like any of that. But Jake Gyllenhaal's performance was fantastic, and the way he looked was really cool, and the way he was able to like manipulate reality practically, that was all awesome. A lot of new locations compared to what we're used to for Spider-Man. Obviously, we're used to just seeing Spider-Man flopping around in New York City, and although I love that, it is cool to see some new places, so I thought that was interesting. And I do like how they have the themes of Spider-Man trying to balance being Spider-Man and being Peter Parker within this film. I think that's one of the most prominent Spider-Man themes out there, and I think they handle that very well here. But the problems I have with this movie, first of all, way too much humor. This has got one of the worst cases of MCU humor out there. Like, it is just so damn much, because look, the problem is that almost every character feels like a comedic genius. They don't ever have these serious moments with any of these characters. Everyone's always trying to make quips and jokes, and it's just too much. Even in serious moments, like when there's those robots are chasing after Happy and the kids, and they make jokes. Like, you're being chased by robots that are trying to kill you. They're trying to shoot you, and you're just cracking jokes. It's not on purpose. I know they're not purposely making jokes, but the scenes are written to make jokes, and it just takes me out of the moment completely, because I'm like, what? Aunt May in this film, I also don't like how she's portrayed in this film, just like she was in the first one. She's basically just turned into a joke about being Happy Hogan's fuck buddy pretty much the whole time. That's basically what she is in this film, and I don't know. And I didn't like how she didn't care about him being Spider-Man. She was just completely fine with it. I feel like that's not realistic for what Aunt May would do in that moment. I feel like she would be like, fuck no, you ain't being Spider-Man. Like, you know what I mean? She would have that kind of reaction. Eventually come around to it, sure. But I just don't believe the fact that she was so on board with it in this film. It felt so off to me. So yeah, I'm not crazy about this movie, but it's not bad. It has a lot of good stuff to it too, so yeah. In number 20th spot, Thor Love and Thunder, a movie that has very similar issues to the movie I just talked about. A lot of the MCU humor problems. Now, I do think some of the comedy in this movie is really funny. Like, a lot of it is actually hilarious, and I actually laughed my ass off a lot going to see this. But that doesn't change the fact that this movie just didn't really warrant as much humor as it did have. There's a lot of serious themes in this movie, and a lot of the serious themes were cool, like handled somewhat well in some scenes. Like, for example, Jane Foster's cancer story. I thought there was a lot of interesting stuff there, and it was really deep and serious. But then they throw jokes about it later on, and it doesn't really work. It doesn't fit that well. I do really love Thor's arc in this movie, the way he's trying to kind of open up his heart. I think that was good. I think it was good for his character. I enjoyed that. I also really enjoyed Christian Bale as Gore the God Butcher, even though they did not do nearly enough with him as what they should have. But he was really good in this movie. I think he is probably one of the scariest villains in the MCU. And I do like seeing all like the gods and the mythology and stuff in this film. I thought that was pretty solid as well. But like I said, too much comedy. I just feel like the comedic Thor, they're getting a little bit too far with this. And this one especially, I felt like it made Thor look like a joke in a lot of the movie. He felt like a joke. Even in Ragnarok, they had a little bit of that, but at least he was able to be badass in more of the film. Compared to this one, I feel like he wasn't that badass. In the scenes where he was badass, it was like just using powers from that lightning bolt. Like, it wasn't the same type of badass I'm used to. And on the other scenes also was just him being a goof, and that was perceived as him being badass, but it didn't feel badass because, again, I just saw it as him being a goof. So I don't know, wasn't a big fan of that. Jane also learning the Thor powers way too quickly. I just didn't really like that. She got so into it so fast. I feel like there should have been more of an arc there. There should have been more of a, takes her time to get used to the powers sort of a thing. But she was just right away, she's like, I'm a badass, and she's just a bit too fast for me, in my opinion. But I don't know. I thought it was good in some ways, but in other ways, not as much. So I'm just gonna put it here. I think this is a good spot for it. In the number 19 spot, I've got Black Widow, a movie that had a lot of hate surrounding it, and I don't understand this amount of hate that it was being given. The only thing I really don't like about this movie, which is a pretty big thing because it's the villain. The villain's a pretty important part to a movie. I wasn't a fan of Taskmaster. I thought they completely took away from the excitement I had for this character, because the idea of Taskmaster is really cool, right? And I'm not really too familiar with the comics, but I do wish they kind of went more in that direction as opposed to the sympathetic, like they're not really a villain direction. I don't really care that it was a girl. I don't really care about that, to be honest. I think it could have worked just fine with Taskmaster being a girl, but the fact that it wasn't an actual villain and it was just someone being controlled by someone else. I feel like it took away from the impact that it could have had for the story. But everything else about the movie, I kind of enjoy. Like, I think the Romanov family is fun to watch, especially Elena more than anyone. Red Guardian's cool too. I do think they do outshine Natasha though, which is a bit of an issue, but it's not a big deal. I think it has a good story. It feels grounded for most of it, and there's some over-the-top crazy stuff towards the end, but I think this is, again, another run-of-the-mill MCU film. It's just kind of average. I don't really have much to say about it. It's just, I had a good time with it. I don't know. I don't think it was that bad. But except for the villain. Everything else was fine, though. In number 18th spot, I've got Iron Man 3. Definitely one of the most underrated MCU films. I love how they deal with Tony's character in this film, specifically with how he has a lot of PTSD after the events of the first Avengers film. I thought it was handled brilliantly, like especially his relationship with that kid, the conversations he's having with him, and he kind of like opens up to him a little bit. Like, I really love how they handle his character. I think this is one of his best movies, period, other than probably Endgame, but I don't know, I really love how they handled Tony in this movie. And he has less armor in this movie too. He's not like constantly in the Iron Man suit. He kind of has to deal without the armor for most of it, and I think that's really cool to see as well. Like, you have a whole action scene where he's just using pieces of his armor, so I thought that was really cool. Pepper Potts and Happy Hogan have a much bigger importance to this story as well compared to the first two, so I thought that was really cool. I mean, they were big parts of the first two movies, but like this one, they felt like even more included, and I really enjoyed that because they're great characters, obviously. The plane sequence is one of my favorite scenes in the MCU, honestly. It's really damn cool. Favorite Iron Man soundtrack as well. I think this is definitely the best main theme for Iron Man. And Aldrich Killian, I kind of like as a villain. I don't think he's that bad. And dialogue in this movie is really good. And a lot of stuff in this movie I like. I don't have a single negative to say. I really don't. I can't think of a negative that I would want to bring up. I just don't think these positives are like that amazing to warrant putting it higher on the list. But I don't really have a negative for this movie. I can't really think of one. In number 17 spot, Thor Ragnarok. This movie went up a little bit compared to what I used to have it at. I used to actually have it a bit lower, but I've kind of come around to it a little bit more. I think my biggest issue with it when it first came out was the comedy, just like Thor Love and Thunder. It went a little bit too far with the comedy, but after seeing Love and Thunder, I was like, okay, this is not nearly as bad. Because this didn't go as far as like Love and Thunder goes. There are still a lot of serious moments in this movie, especially when it comes to Thor and Loki's father, Odin. There's a lot of serious moments there. I think Hela as a villain was pretty serious for the most part, and she was a really great villain, so that's cool. Thor and Loki's chemistry in this movie, I think, is my favorite thing about it, though. Just seeing them together for most of the movie, working together, was really awesome. Seeing Hulk in this movie was cool too, because we don't see Hulk all that often, really, in these movies, so it was just nice to see him in this one. And it's visually stunning, this one. It's definitely one of the most creative in terms of the visuals for the MCU, so I really enjoy this movie. It's just, like I said, the comedy takes it a bit too far in some places, and I don't know, maybe I just don't like Taika Waititi's comedy. I think that's the problem, because it's his two movies where I'm just like, your comedy, you do too much with it. You have funny jokes here and there, but like, you can pull back every now and then. You don't have to just try so hard to make us laugh. In number 16 spot, I actually have Black Panther Wakanda Forever. I'm not going to go too in depth with it because I just recorded a review for it like literally an hour ago, but I really enjoyed this movie. This is where we're starting to get to the movies where I actually quite enjoyed them. I would give the rest of these movies on this list at least an 8 out of 10. Black Panther Wakanda Forever handled T'Challa's death pretty much perfectly. I think it was really respectful how they did it. They didn't put too much focus on it to the point where it was like overbearing, but they did enough to the point where it respected him, it honored him, and the movie's plot does really focus around that. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't do too much with it, but it does just enough to the point where you really feel it the whole movie, and it's a really emotional and impactful film because of that. And I love Shuri's character in this film and the way how she becomes a new Black Panther and the way she honors T'Challa as much as she can. And she almost goes against that because she ends up going, spoilers, this is going to have spoilers, by the way. I probably should have mentioned that before, but spoilers. The way she sees Killmonger in the Ancestral Plane, I think kind of led her to almost kind of heading to the dark side a little bit. Talking about it like it's Star Wars, but she was almost going to darkness by killing Namor. She almost did, but then she kind of held back when she realized, who her brother is, she cares more about that than vengeance, just to, avenge her mother. So I really love that. Great soundtrack, great visuals. I really enjoyed the story as well. Like, it didn't have too much action, this movie. If you're really looking for the action, this movie just didn't really have much of that. And the action that was there wasn't that great either. That was one of my biggest negatives. But I will say, I really, really love the story of this movie. So that's easily what's putting it up this high. That's why I like it more than the first one. But like I said, it's held back a little bit just because the action wasn't as great and effects weren't as great. And the next 15 movies on this list, I just like them more. In number 15 spot, I've got Avengers: Age of Ultron. This is also a movie I would consider completely underrated. I think people give this movie way too much hate. I do agree it's a little messy in some points in the film. The structure's a little bit messy. But other than that, I really enjoyed this movie. Ultron is an interesting villain. He's not perfect, definitely not perfect. He's not as good as he should have been. I think the comic version was just, we were all having a lot of anticipation for it because of that, but didn't completely land. I still really like Ultron in this movie. I think Vision is one of my favorite parts though. Vision, this is the first movie he's in, of course, and wow, I mean, the dialogue and conversations this man has, especially that scene where he talks to Ultron at the end, is like so good. Like the philosophical stuff that goes on in that man's mind. I miss Vision a lot. I think we're going to be seeing some more of him again, and they have announced some like White Vision series or something, but I don't know. Really enjoyed Vision in this. It had the same charm as the first Avengers film, but almost on another level because we just had more stuff in it. So I enjoyed that quite a bit. Obviously, we had the introduction of Wanda and Quicksilver, and they were great. I enjoyed them. I think people were a little bit upset about Quicksilver dying so soon, but I was okay with it. It definitely built up Wanda's character quite a bit, so I was definitely happy with that. And the action is phenomenal. A lot of great action, a lot of awesome locations too, the different places they're fighting. It's a very eventful movie. I enjoy it. I do think it's a little bit messy in some places, but it's not that bad. In number 14 spot, I've got Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. This one is probably best known for its action more than anything. I think the story is good, but it's not like amazing. But I love how this action is directed in this movie. It's some of the best directed and choreographed action in the entire MCU. It's all like hand-to-hand stuff, martial arts type stuff. It's really well done. The only problem is towards the end of the film, they kind of forget about this whole grounded hand-to-hand combat stuff, and we get this giant CGI dragon, which I thought was okay. It definitely goes more into that generic MCU formula as opposed to doing something very different. But most of the film still is just really incredible with how all the action's shot, and I do really enjoy the story as well. I just don't think it's like incredible. I just think some of the elements of the story are really great though, especially the villain is probably one of the best villains in the MCU. He is really interesting, and seeing his back and forths with his son in this movie I think was just so well handled all the way through. So yeah, it's a really solid movie. The colors are so good. This is a solid movie. In number 13th spot, I've got Captain America: The First Avenger. This one also kind of underrated in a few ways. I think the World War II setting is definitely very different for the MCU, and I think it fits quite a bit. I think Steve's character is he's so likable because he's heroic even before he becomes a superhero, and I think that's obviously very much the reason why he becomes worthy in Avengers Endgame, because like he's just always been this very heroic person who will do whatever it takes to help others. That's all he cares about, is helping others. So he was like the perfect soldier, and of course he just didn't have the body for it, but then once he's given the body for it, then he just becomes this complete, force of nature. And I really love his story in this movie. Peggy Carter is awesome too. It's great to see her in this. I'm glad they keep using her again in future movies in different ways, because I think her story in this one's really great, especially her chemistry with Steve Rogers is phenomenal. I don't really have any issues with this movie. Red Skull, great villain as well. I don't think he's amazing or anything, but he's a good villain. I enjoy him. So yeah, it's a good movie. Every movie here on out, I think, is like a 9 out of 10 or higher. I think we're starting to get to the really solid movies that I just really enjoy, and I think are just the prime examples of great MCU content. Number 12 is going to be Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Volume 2 gets way more hate than it should, I feel like. I don't ever understood it. I definitely not as good as the first one, sure, but it doesn't deserve the hate it gets. This movie is really great. The humor is just as good as the first one. Then maybe they taken some weird directions at some points. Like they had a couple of jokes that were kind of overdone, like the Drax making fun of Mantis. That stuff kind of just got old. Like it was just nonstop. He was just calling her stupid and ugly for like the whole movie, and it's just like, okay, it was funny the first 2 times, but you can calm down now. James Gunn sometimes does that with his movies, where his jokes just go on way too long. But some of it was great, just as good as the first one. Ego, I think, is one of the best villains in the MCU. That is by far my favorite thing about this movie. I think Ego is one of the most interesting, and just, he's obviously not a good person, but his motivation for what he's doing is just so like, what the fuck? And it's really cool to see that confrontation he has with his son when he then obviously tells Peter that he was the one who killed Peter's mom. He caused the tumor to get put into her head, and that's what caused her to die. And he just right then and there just shuts off any possible care for his father, and then just goes full on against him. So I really love that. The relationship between Rocket Raccoon and Yondu in this movie is one of my favorite, like, back and forths between any characters in the entire MCU. The way they kind of learn that they're basically the same person, they're both broken, they've both been treated poorly in the past. Like, I really love how that all works out. And then obviously Yondu's death, incredibly emotional, and probably one of the best death scenes in the MCU. So a lot of great stuff to this movie. My only issue, other than, like I said, some of the humor being a little bit like they take it too far sometimes, I would say, is the fact that they're all split up. I don't really like that, because they work so good as a team, and they're only really together in the very beginning and the very end. It's a big chunk in the middle of the movie where they're just all apart. I think they could have worked better if they were together for more of it, especially because their stories are very separate too. So it makes things feel a little messy, but I think it does come together nicely in the end. And I really love a lot of what this movie does, you know, between the beginning and end especially. In number 11 spot, I've got Ant-Man, the first Ant-Man. This is definitely a lot higher than most people probably would put it. But I really enjoyed this movie. I think it was the main movie that got me into the MCU in the first place. I didn't really watch the MCU before this, except for, like, you know, I watched like Spider-Man movies and such. I didn't really watch the MCU. But I think around this time I learned that Spider-Man was going to be added to the MCU soon. So I was like, you know what, I might as well start watching here. And Ant-Man really just got me into it. Like, I was like, this is pretty good. Like, this is pretty awesome. And I think a big part of it was just how unique a lot of the story was, and how unique a lot of the action was compared to your typical movies, because obviously he's tiny, so they do a lot of cool things with that. I really love, especially the end battle against Yellow Jacket. I think it's just all really well shot. This movie's definitely not that serious, like the stakes aren't that high, but it's a really just solid, fun, family, down-to-earth film that I don't have anything against it. Like, there's not a single thing I can say that I don't like about this movie. It just does everything that it's supposed to do, and it does it fairly well, I guess. So yeah, Ant-Man is awesome. It's so cool. I can't wait to see Quantumania, because I want to see more of these like tiny action scenes. You know, it's awesome. Paul Rudd is obviously amazing, so that definitely helps out the movie quite a bit. But there's a lot of other stuff here too. Michael Douglas as Hank Pym was an awesome addition. So yeah, great movie. In number 10 spot, I've got Spider-Man Homecoming. So this is actually not that high on my Spider-Man ranking, but I'll be honest, I love a lot of the Spider-Man movies. So if I was to be ranking all the comic book movies, you would see a lot of the Spider-Man movies quite high up. So even though Homecoming's in the top 10 MCU, it's probably only in my top, like, I don't know, 40 comic book movies, somewhere in there, maybe top 30, I'm not sure. But yeah, I really enjoy this movie. Only issues I have, same thing as Far From Home, a bit too much comedy. Some of it's a lot of that like Disney cringe comedy that it just cringes me sometimes. Some of the comedy, some of it's great though, some of it's amazing, some of it's not so much. Aunt May, like I said, doesn't have much of a focus, and she's not really like, she doesn't really have much of a character here, so I don't like that too much. And I was never against the whole, you know, Iron Man being a big part of the movie, but some of it does kind of bother me a little bit, especially with Vulture's motivation being surrounded upon that, and the suit and everything. I do wish he was a little bit less involved, but I can kind of forgive it because at least towards the end of the movie, they do have him get restricted of his suit, and we get to see him just in his own homemade suit for the end battle against Vulture. I'm gonna put battle in air quotes because it wasn't really a battle, to be honest, but you know, the end scene, they do put him in his original costume, so I do like that a lot. But the movie otherwise just deals with a lot of typical high school drama issues, and I think that makes perfect sense for a Spider-Man film, so I do really like that a lot. It does a really good job of being a smaller scale, friendly neighborhood type movie. It feels like it's perfect for the first Spider-Man film for a younger version of Peter Parker, because obviously he's much younger than any other Peter Parker we've seen in live action at this point, so that was really great. Vulture, fantastic villain. I really love how his story was very down to earth and grounded. He didn't have some like crazy big plan or anything. It was just simple as like, I just got to make some money for my daughter and my family. Like, that's all he cares about. And I love that twist of him being Liz's dad. That was one of my favorite MCU twists of all time. My theater was just like gasping when that happened, and it's awesome. Really cool, really cool. Number 9 is what started it all, Iron Man. So Iron Man is just such a well-rounded movie. I do think the beginning parts were a little bit slower than they could have been, but that's like the only negative I can possibly pull out of my ass, because other than that, it's pretty much a perfect movie. It's got such a great introduction to Tony Stark as a character, and again, he's just very cocky, borderline narcissistic for most of the movie, and you know, he's not really likable either. Like, he's just not a very likable person because of that, but he does come around to changing quite a bit, mainly because of what happens in the, you know, beginning of the movie, and then he eventually, you kind of see him dealing with the whole idea of the suit around the world thing, you know, trying to, you know, expand the military power, and I really love how he gets into this situation with Obadiah, also known as the Ironmonger, and they have probably one of the more interesting back and forths between a hero and a villain in the MCU. Again, it's much more grounded, but it still feels like there is a big threat there to be had with this character. This movie just works on all levels. Like, Jon Favreau just knew how to direct this. He knew what to do, and he accomplished exactly what, you know, he should have done. So I'm really thankful for this movie, because otherwise we wouldn't have had this incredible universe be expanded upon in future years. So really, really great movie. Number 8, The Avengers, the first Avengers film. I used to have this a bit higher. It went a little bit lower, but it's still really great, right? I think bringing every character that was in the MCU at this point together in this film is just so hard to pull off, but they do it with ease. Like, they do it really effectively as well, not just with ease. And I think a big part of that is the chemistry between all these characters. They work off of each other so well. Like I said, I liked Edward Norton as Bruce Banner, but I think Mark Ruffalo in this one as Bruce Banner is probably the best version of Bruce Banner we've ever seen, in my opinion. I really, really love him in this film. And a lot of the conversations he has with Tony Stark, with Steve Rogers, with Thor, all in the helicarrier especially, those scenes are some of my favorite scenes in the MCU. They're really like real conversations about this universe and how, you know, everything works, and different, you know, ideas that each of them have, and different like conflicts of philosophies and stuff. It's a lot of those real conversations, real dialogue, but then they just get us with amazing action later on. We have the helicarrier stuff that goes down. That stuff gets kind of crazy, but then once you get into New York City itself, it's just a full-on battle, and you got just 6 of them taking on a whole-ass army, which is a lot of people. Like, it's not just a couple, you know, the Chitauri's fucking huge. They got all the aliens coming from the space things, and a lot of shit going down, right? Loki in this movie is great as well. So much to this movie that I just absolutely love. The humor's there as well, and the humor is good. It works. It doesn't stick too long. It just stays in the moments that it should, and then when it gets past that moment, you're done with it, right? This movie just worked exactly the way it should have, and it nailed it. In number 7 spot, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I know, this one is gonna get me fucking thrown off the internet, because everyone seems to hate this movie for some reason. As a horror fan, I think the horror elements of this movie is really what got me more than anything, if I'm gonna be completely honest. But there's a lot of other stuff about this movie I really, really love as well. Wanda, one of my favorite villains in the MCU, because her motivations are very, very, you know, they're very, very understandable, but it's like she just goes batshit crazy because of those motivations, and it's So I'm so glad they went there. I'm so glad she actually was a villain and they didn't cop out and kind of make her team up or something with Doctor Strange to fight some other evil. I'm so glad they didn't cop out with that. Of course, towards the end, she kind of came, to her ways, but it wasn't just like a snap of the finger change. It took the whole movie to get to that gradual change for her character, and a lot of it was obviously set around her children. And I love how they handle a lot of the multiverse in this movie. They could have gone further with it. I wish they went a little bit further with it. They definitely could have done a lot more with the multiverse. It should have been more of a multiverse of madness, but I still think what they did do was still really awesome. Getting to see the Illuminati, especially with certain cameo appearances, like of course Reed Richards and Professor X and Captain Carter, and just really awesome to see them. I know they're just cameos, are just there for fun, but it was cool to see them, and I liked how they had that one action scene with them. That was one of my favorite action scenes in the MCU because it was like brutal as hell. But I do kind of wish, they did a little bit more with the cameos, like I said in my review for this movie earlier in the year. But a lot of my problems with the movie is just like missed opportunities. It's never like I have an issue with the actual film itself. It's just me wanting more of it. You know what I mean? So I can't really say that makes the movie worse. It's just like, oh yeah, it could have been a lot better. It could have definitely been, much better than what our expectations were, but anything really could have, to be honest. I love Doctor Strange's character in this movie as well. I love how they handle him. I love how he kind of just feels like he can't win because he's like, no matter what universe he's in, he can't have the love of his life that he, of course, loves Christine, and he just can't have her any universe. And that was something that really he kind of had to come to accept that. And I think America Chavez in this movie was pretty solid as well. She's a really new character and didn't really know anything about her going into the movie, but I thought she was pretty solid. I think Wong was at his best in this movie. The visuals in this movie were outstanding. Some of the best visuals in the entire MCU as well. I said that for a lot of movies, but there are a lot of MCU movies that have great visuals. This one is no different. The colors are just wonderful. And like I said, the horror elements are by far what puts this movie above the rest, without a doubt. Sam Raimi's directing as well is just insanely incredible. Like the shots this movie does, again, that is what makes this movie feel more unique than any other Marvel movie that came out around this time, and that is why it is this high on my ranking. And I can't wait to see more horror type stuff in the MCU. I know they did just do Werewolf by Night recently, which I have yet to see, but I will get to it eventually. And the top 6 are all pretty much nearly 10 out of 10 movies, all 6 of them. These are prime examples of just almost near masterpieces. So let's get into it. Number 6, Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Fantastic movie all around. So this is the first movie directed by the Russo brothers, and if you haven't realized, I haven't put a single Russo brothers movies on here yet. And there's 4 of them. There's 4 Russo brothers movies in the MCU, and I'm in the top 6, and I just got to the first one. So that probably tells you who's my favorite of the directors from the MCU. In terms of their MCU films, obviously, I do think Sam Raimi's a better director, but, based on the MCU movies they've directed, Russo brothers are king at that, for sure. For some reason, they can't direct outside of these movies for some reason, because every time they make a movie outside of it, it's just not that great. But these movies are fantastic. So, Captain America: The Winter Soldier, I love how it feels so much more serious and grounded and gritty compared to a lot of other movies. It definitely takes a much more like spy thriller, spy espionage route, and it goes really deep with that. Everything that goes on in this movie with, the shady stuff going on with Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. and, well, S.H.I.E.L.D. really being Hydra, I really, really love how that all plays out, and it again plays like a thriller. Obviously, the Winter Soldier himself, of course, Bucky, is probably the highlight of this movie, and I love pretty much everything once Steve, obviously the first 2 acts is great too, but I think the point where he finds out that the Winter Soldier is Bucky till the end of the movie is some of the best MCU stuff, because he has this really deep like dilemma of what he does about this, because this is his best friend, right? He hasn't obviously, seen him in a while, but it's his best friend, and he doesn't really know what to do about the situation. And so the way they handle it is just brilliant. The way he won't fight back against him because he really just wants to get his friend to snap out of it, to snap out of the I guess you can say spell he's been put in. And especially that scene where he tells him, like, I'm with you to the end of the line. and they fall in the water together. Like, it's definitely one of the best MCU scenes for sure. I really love the action in this movie. It is directed and choreographed to perfection. Like, all of it is just shot so damn well. Black Widow in this movie is amazing. Samuel Jackson as Nick Fury in this movie is amazing. Just so many elements of this movie are perfect. I don't have a single negative to say. It is pretty much a near perfect MCU film. In number 5 spot, I've got Guardians of the Galaxy. So this movie handles humor and emotion so perfectly. It blends it together in such a nice way. I mean, the movie literally starts, okay, with Peter, getting his final moments with his mother because she's dying of cancer, and he gets sucked up by an alien ship, and the movie just cuts to now him in the future singing and dancing with the cassette player and listening to it and kicking around these little like creatures and singing to the creature. Like, it's such a weird shift, but it works. Like, we were talking about Thor: Love and Thunder, how they try to mix serious themes with, these goofy jokes, and it just doesn't really work, but it works in this movie. And I don't really know how he does it. James Gunn does it very, very well. I don't really get it exactly, but it works. It never feels like it's coming across as undermining those serious themes. It just kind of feels like it's just a gradual tone shift in a very organic way, and it is fantastic. This movie is one of the only MCU movies to make me cry. There's a couple that have, but this is definitely one of them. And it was obviously towards the end of the film with the whole thing with Groot, and it gets you to do that because the whole movie really builds up the camaraderie between these characters, and you would not expect them to so easily, but they do. And obviously they have so many things that go on with them, and there's so many things that go wrong for them just continuously, but they just always kind of have this care for each other just naturally. And you wouldn't think they would ever care for each other towards the end of the film, but they do, because they go through so much in this movie. There's so many things that just keep happening to them and nonstop, and by the time we get to the end, that's why they start to care for each other so much, and we get to see them actually coming together as the Guardians of the Galaxy when they start all holding hands with each other, holding shoulders, whatever they did, and taking on the Power Stone together to defeat Ronan the Accuser. And Ronan the Accuser, not that good of a villain, but he is perfect in this movie because the villain doesn't really matter that much. It's not really the main focus, but him being this really serious villain just works so well off of these very, unserious main characters, and I love how that works. So I don't know, really awesome. The Guardians themselves, they all have such unique personalities, and I think that's why they work so well off of each other. Is they're just so different from one another, and each of them have their own place in the story, and each of them are all amazing in their own ways. I love each and every one of those characters. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 cannot come soon enough. I'm for sure it's going to be amazing just because of how emotional it's probably going to be, because these characters are some of the best characters in the MCU, in my honest opinion. So I love this movie. And of course, it was the first MCU movie to go so grand scale with everything, because it's set in places other than just Earth. We go out of Earth. I was talking about how, it was cool to see Black Panther going to like other countries and such, more so than just United States. But this is taking things, intergalactically, taking things out of Earth, taking things to other planets, other places, other galaxies. And that is just so awesome. It's so inventive, so creative, and everything they do in this movie, I love it. It's a solid movie. I actually watched this movie for the first time on an airplane, so that shows you some true dedication. Number 4 is going to be Captain America Civil War. Civil War is the first movie to get me really into the MCU. Like I said before, that I watched Ant-Man, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll start watching the MCU. But Civil War is when I really fell in love with it, where I finally realized how special this is, and I felt like this is something that can really grow to be something even bigger, and it really kind of has kept growing to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is one of my favorites of all time for a lot of reasons. So first of all, Russo Brothers directing is outstanding, just like it was for Winter Soldier. Really incredible action sequences all around. But I love how this movie takes a realistic situation that superheroes would probably have to deal with, and it focuses the entire movie just on that. because it makes sense. Like, we see all these movies, we see them causing all this destruction, and it's not their faults really, it's obviously the villain's fault, but there still is destruction going down, and it makes sense that there would be consequences to that. There would be people who would blame them for it. So this movie having the situation where that happens, and obviously Winter Soldier kind of escalates that because Zemo's kind of controlling Winter Soldier to keep doing that type of stuff. So we get these situations where half of our superheroes are now like, we kind of do need to be put in check, and it is really political in a lot of ways, but it's not so cut and dry of like who is right or wrong. Like, they both have good points, and at least for myself, I can never really choose sides between Iron Man and Captain America, because they both, like I said, have really damn good points, and you always just want them to find a compromise, but they really can't, because there really is no good compromise that they can do, at least a fast compromise. So you're constantly fighting over who you should be rooting for, and I think that works just so well because it's so different than what we're used to with obviously rooting for the main character and then just, you know, hating the villain, whereas in this you don't have that. The villain obviously is Zemo, but he's not the one in the action, he's not the one fighting, he's just behind the scenes causing all this mess. And the movie gets really serious when it has to be, especially the ending, which I absolutely love. I mean, the airport sequence is awesome, but it's more fun and it's kind of more lighthearted, and it's really cool. But once we get to the end and you see Tony's reaction to seeing that the Winter Soldier did in fact kill his parents, that is a heartbreaking scene. And then it leads to a fight between these two characters that have been like almost brothers, you know, before this. And the rest of the series, I don't want to go as far as say brothers, but they were really damn close in some scenes. And it was heartbreaking to see them fight each other and for it to be so serious all the way through. Not a single joke, not a single quip, just two dudes fighting it out. Of course, you know, Bucky was in there too, but man, it was good. Like, this is just really, really awesome. And obviously you introduced a lot of new characters in movies as well. You introduced Black Panther, you introduced Spider-Man, and a lot of the other existing characters were already here anyways, so it did kind of in some ways feel like an Avengers film, but it still has the main focus being on Captain America. And of course you also have Falcon there coming back from the Winter Soldier, and he was great in this movie as well. So yeah, this is just gonna go down as one of the best MCU films for sure. In number 3 spot, Spider-Man No Way Home. So kind of similar to Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, the only negatives I really had for this movie is just kind of missed opportunities. Like, I just wish it did a lot more with the concept. I wish they went a little bit further. I wish some of the characters had more to do. Like, for example, I wish they gave more for Sandman and Lizard to do. I also wish they threw in another member too, because it wasn't a Sinister Six. I was kind of hoping it would be 6 people. They could have thrown in like Rhino or something. I don't know, anyone else, and it would have been a little bit more interesting to me. But this movie does so many things right. First of all, giving the OG Spider-Man films a major importance to the MCU, I think was just really cool, because I just wasn't expecting there actually to have importance to those films. Whereas I was expecting cameos or something, like, oh, they're just gonna appear and they'll be like, oh my god, look. But no, they actually have a story here. They actually have their stories carry over, like all of them, the villains, as well as Toby and Andrew. So I love that. The Green Goblin, his character in this film was probably even better than how he was in the first one. I do think the other villains weren't as good as they were in their own films, but Green Goblin felt like he was the one that was improved in this film, and I fucking love the performance from Willem Dafoe in this movie. It's just outstanding, man. He is amazing as Norman Osborn in this movie, and some of those scenes are just, oh my god, incredible. I absolutely love how this fixed my issue with MCU Peter as well. The fact that at the end of the movie, he makes it so everyone forgets who he is, and he has to make that really hard decision, that really hard sacrifice, and that to me is a Spider-Man thing. Like, that is so damn, you know, like courageous and brave and like selfless. And the fact that he does it and we get this new version of Spider-Man that we're now going to be seeing later on is amazing, because it goes back to what Spider-Man should be, where no one knows his true identity. They just know he's Spider-Man, and that's it. And I prefer that. So I'm really glad they went with that. To me, like I said, it fixed my issues with MCU Peter. They also fixed my issues with Aunt May being nothing but just a bunch of jokes. She actually had a serious role in this movie, and her death was really important for his character as well, because there was actual stakes there. There was actual things where he is now losing people in his life that we get to see. Obviously, we know he lost Uncle Ben, but we didn't get to see that, so now we actually get to see it. It completely changed a lot of how I felt about MCU Peter. And like I said, Tobey and Andrew being actual characters in this film was amazing. The interactions they had with each other, I mean, it was like a dream come true. How can no one not freak out in excitement over these characters interacting with each other? And even just the villains interacting was all so great. The Daredevil cameo was cool, even though it was just one little scene. It was cool enough. The humor was pretty great in this movie all around. I thought it actually had some pretty good humor compared to other MCU films. And the theme of responsibility is highly present here. One of the best Spider-Man themes out there, and it is really a major part of how this entire film works. And I think my only issue, like I said, is just a lot of missed opportunities. That's it. It's just, you could have done more. You could have done this, you could have done that. I wish we saw more original soundtracks returning, stuff like that. Like, it was a lot of stuff where I just wish they did more. In some cases, a little bit less as well, because there was a couple of fan servicey things that I did not like. Like, for example, Norman Osborn saying the phrase, "Oh, I'm something of a scientist myself." Like, I hated that. I hated that so much. But this movie's fantastic. Near masterpiece. Easily my favorite movie of 2021, and easily one of the best Spider-Man movies. But not the best Spider-Man. I actually prefer Spider-Man 2. If you saw my Spider-Man ranking, you know that. In number 2 spot, Avengers Infinity War. So yeah, last 2 movies left. You guys probably know which 2 they are, but Infinity War is gonna be number 2 spot. Probably not what most people were thinking, because a lot of people absolutely love Infinity War. A lot of people probably have this at their number 1 spot, but I, of course, love this one as well. I don't have anything bad to say about it. The next 2 films, I don't really have much bad to say about it, but this one, definitely don't have anything bad to say about it. Easily the most action-packed MCU film. Easily the best paced MCU film. It's just constant, like, non-stop stuff's happening, and it works so well. It's the most jam-packed too. I mean, you have so many characters in this movie, so many crossovers, like, it's just insane how many people are in this movie, but it just works so well. You never feel like they're wasting any time with any characters. You never feel like they're rushing things either. Everyone just kind of comes in and has their place in the film, and it works perfectly. And obviously, the best thing about this movie is Thanos. Thanos is a masterpiece of a villain. Like, he is so well written. You understand his motivation. You think it's fucked up, but you understand it, and it makes sense, and it could work, right? And he is badass, scary, terrifying, menacing. The stakes are so high in this movie. Yes, there's a lot of jokes in this movie, but they make sure to shut up with the jokes when the serious scenes are happening. When things are going down, it is purely serious, and things do go down. A lot of people die in this. Of course, some of them still come back in other projects and other ways, but these specific versions of these characters are dead, and they stay dead. Loki, first scene of the movie, one of my favorite openings to a movie ever. Loki's killed. That stays true. I know we have the Loki show, but that's another version of him, technically. So that version, dead, right? Then you have Vision, dead. And then you have all the characters that get dusted away. Oh, Gamora as well, dead. Then you get, everyone dusted away. We know they're going to come back, but it doesn't take away the impact that scene has on all the characters, because the characters don't know they're coming back. We know they're coming back. The characters don't know. So they get tremendously impacted by that event. And again, it is done masterfully. And Thanos is what creates all this threat. He is what makes you just on the edge of your seat this whole time. I mean, everything that happened in this movie just makes you you can't wait to see what happens next, right? This movie was an event. It's one of my favorite stories. It's so good. It's so good. And of course, the bad guys win in the end, which is not something you normally expect from an MCU film. It's very different than what we're used to, and that's why it works so well. In number 1 spot, though, is going to be Avengers Endgame. Unpopular opinion, I know. But the reason I have this over Infinity War, I personally think it's because I am much more of a person who prefers character-driven stories compared to just, really well-done action stories. And I do think Infinity War focuses way more on the action. There's a lot of great character stuff there, but it is mostly based on the action. But Endgame really takes its time with the characters. I mean, the first like 60 minutes of this movie is just focused on grief, and that's it. We get to see these characters grieving over the losses they had, and they can't really fix what happened. Like you see before, you know, they have the time jump obviously, but before the time jump, they're dealing with the immediate grief, and the immediate grief is really, really, you know, there. Like they're all really, really confused and they don't know what the hell to do. And then once they get to Thanos and they realize there's nothing they can do, you know, Thor just kills him because that's all he knows of what they can possibly do. That's his only solution, is let's just kill him and then we'll just, I don't know. They don't have a plan. And that's why it's just so impactful, because they don't have a plan. So all of them lose hope, right? Not all of them, but most of them lose hope. And they're just kind of going through life like there's nothing we can do, you know? There's some people who won't give up, obviously, you know. Steve Rogers was pretty much the prime example of someone who's not going to give up. But he also kind of starts to feel like, you know, I don't really know what we can do. So he just tries to start seeing the brighter side of life. He's talking to Natasha, saying about, oh, well, at least the rivers are clear and stuff. And he's just trying to look at the bright side of things. I just love how all the characters deal with grief so differently. And that's why I was completely okay with the whole fat Thor thing. A lot of people hated that, but I thought it was fine because it was another way a character could deal with grief. He dealt with it in a way where he didn't care about his body anymore. He just kind of kept drinking, and he wasn't, you know, working out or doing any action-y battle things anymore. He was just sitting around playing video games and drinking. So of course he got fat. Like, it made sense for his character, and I like how they showcased a different way to you know, deal with grief, and all the characters do. Fucking Tony has a damn kid. That's his way of dealing with it. He has a kid, and then when we finally get, you know, Ant-Man comes back and he has a plan. There's finally a plan. Some characters aren't down for it. Tony's not really down for it at first because he's like, well, what if I lose what I currently have? And that dilemma there is just so good. And seeing him talk to Pepper Potts about it, it's just such great dialogue. Like, I get it. Some people prefer the action. They're probably going to prefer Infinity War. But I think the first 60 minutes of Endgame is my favorite stuff from the entire MCU. And I'm not even exaggerating on that. Like, I fucking love those scenes in the first half of that movie. And then once you get into the actual plan being implemented, it's more of just like a time heist, and it's fun. It's got the fun side of the MCU, which you definitely need some fun in these movies. It can't all be serious and dark and depressing stuff. So it's nice to see that, and you get like 40 minutes of just, you know, fun time heist stuff. You get a lot of flashbacks. Well, you don't call them flashbacks, but I guess nostalgia trips of the past, and I really enjoyed all those sequences. It was cool to see them again, even though a lot of it was fan service. It was fun fan service, so I didn't really care. It was well done as well, and they made time travel make sense too. I'm glad they did that. It actually made sense what they were explaining. It wasn't like Back to the Future where it just there's a lot of loopholes that can be done with that. The time travel in this world actually feels like there isn't too many loopholes that can be done with it, and I think it definitely makes it more interesting that way. And then towards the end of the time heist, things starts getting serious again. We see, you know, Natasha has to die the same way Gamora did, and that was incredibly sad because they needed the stone. That's what their whole plan was. So that happens. And then you have, of course, the scenes, which I love these scenes, with Tony and his father talking. I mean, those scenes were just amazing. And you even get the scene with Steve looking at Peggy Carter through the window, and I thought that was incredible. And then we get into the ending, and the last 40 minutes is just an incredible battle that's just so much like what we've been waiting for. Like, so much payoff. All these characters fighting. Like, literally every character in the MCU up to that point that's still alive is in that battle. And it's just like, wow. Like, you know, is everyone just fighting against Thanos and his army? I mean, how can you not love that stuff? It's so damn good. And of course, the portal scene is one of the best scenes as well. We all knew they were coming back, but it was so great to see it. Everyone just coming out of the portals. The music was amazing, and everyone just building up to Cap saying Avengers Assemble. And you can't tell me that's not one of the best movie moments of all time. Like, you can't tell me it's not, right? And even just everything leading up to that, just a lot of great action scenes. Again, Russo brothers know how to direct action. They do so great with it. And I love how this film focuses on the main 6 Avengers more than anyone, and obviously a lot of them get killed off or just retire, I guess, with Captain America's story. And that's cool because the first one was so focused on Thanos. He was like the main focus, basically, and he was the one trying to collect all the time stones. Whereas in this one, or not all the time stones, all the Infinity Stones. And in this one, it's all of are people trying to collect, the Infinity Stones from, going back in the past. So I just think it's a cool parallel. I like that a lot. I think that's really awesome. And like I said, the way the movie's split, I think the structure is incredible. A lot of people don't like the pacing because I think the ending's the only exciting part. And like I said, I disagree. The first act is all about grief. The second act is all about hope. Third act is all about the fight. I think it's just such a great structure for a film. And it leads to, of course, Tony Stark's sacrifice, which is so well written because Tony Stark has been this character that you would never expect to do that, right? He's always been a bit more, egotistical, a little bit selfish at some points. And then he ends his story by being the most selfless person on the planet, right? He literally gets himself killed to save everyone else because he knows the only way to save everyone. And it's just such an incredible moment. It's so sad and emotional. And then Cap does the exact opposite. He's the person who's just so, selfless the whole franchise pretty much. He would put his life on the line for anyone at any moment. But then he finally realizes he deserves some time for himself. He deserves to be a little selfish because everyone deserves to give themselves something every now and then. He doesn't do that enough. So he gives himself a love life. He goes back to be with Peggy. He gives himself an actual normal life so he can just enjoy himself, and he deserved that in that moment. He did so much for the entire world, so he finally just felt like he could just settle down, and he does it, and it's perfect ending for his character. Same way Tony's ending was perfect. This movie's perfect. One of my favorite movies of all time, not just MCU, it's one of my favorite movies of all time, period. So yeah, I really love that movie. That is going to do it for my ranking. Let me know your guys' ranking of every MCU film in the comments down below. Very excited to see what you guys have to say. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Peace out, everyone.